Greetings, magical mavens, it's Afira here, and as promised in my winter solstice decorating vlogs earlier this season, this video will be a tutorial on several fun eco and budget-friendly DIY ornaments for your Yule tree. Last year, I went with a very regal celestial theme in blues, whites, and golds, and at the time, I actually painted most of my old baubles blue. But this year, I wanted to try something totally different and focus more on the earthy side of the winter solstice themes rather than the heavenly. So other than a few neutral ornaments, this meant I was pretty much starting from scratch with a whole new decor scheme. Lately, I've been really leaning into the earth element, so I decided this solstice tide season was the perfect time to try making natural and upcycled ornaments using plant matter and other items I already had in my craft stash. We'll be making a multitude of different types of ornaments out of oranges, as well as pine cones, cinnamon sticks, champagne corks, tin foil, and some other random odds and ends. We'll also be making garland out of popcorn and cranberries, which is a lot of fun. For me, this decorating project was one big abundance and prosperity spell for my home and hearth in the new year in honor of the earth element. And I invite you to stay tuned to the end of the video to see me put all of these little magical charms onto my 2 little trees that I keep up year round to decorate for each of the 8 witches' Sabbaths. Plus, we're putting up a new 6-foot tree to temporarily transform my living room into an enchanted winter wonderland. Are you ready to make some magic? I invite you to grab a goblet of glog and let's get started. For our first ornament, let's make baubles out of whole citrus fruits. I saw these online for the first time this year, and to be honest, I was totally at a loss to guess how they had hollowed out a whole orange peel. It's actually extremely simple, and it'll make your home smell like oranges, which is a great bonus to any home and hearth prosperity spell. We're starting with this one because, in case you're following along live, you'll want to start this one first. As brainlessly simple as it is to make, it takes the longest to be ready. All you need to do is carefully slice vertical slits into the fruit, making sure not to cut yourself or to cut the fruit deep enough that each strip of skin isn't still connected to all the others at the north and south poles of the fruit. I experimented with different numbers of slits, but ultimately I decided that 8, representative of the 8 checkpoints on the Wheel of the Year, was my favorite. But the more slits you add, the more difficult it is, so if you're worried, just stick to 4. And try to make them as evenly spaced as possible. This can get very juicy, so I recommend doing this against a cutting board, not in midair like I'm doing here for the camera, but hey, citrus fruit was used as a natural cleansing and clearing solution and scent freshener, so let's just hope the drops that got into my carpet blessed my home instead of just making it sticky. The next step is important. Do your best to place the fruit on a baking tray in a position where one of the poles is facing down and the vertical cuts are facing directly up and down. We're going to be baking these below 200 degrees for several hours, and in the process, whichever part of the fruit is touching the pan will flatten and burn a little bit. There are probably ways around this, but I just plan to place them mindfully and then cover up the ugly parts later. Plan to check on your fruit about once per hour if you've never done this before. Even though there's no way it'll be done in less than 3 hours, it helps to keep an eye on it so that you have a better idea of how they're coming along and if any adjustments need to be made to their positioning or to the temperature of the oven. You definitely do not want these to burn. You'll know they're about done when you can clearly see that they've shrunk and that their innards have shrunk all the way into the center of the fruit. Mine were still fairly soft in the end, but they were much stiffer overall and seemed to be quite dry through and through. Now, this is my first time trying this, and I'm not sure exactly how correctly I did it. My intention for these was to have them be as fully dried out as possible without looking too burnt, and my hope is that these will stay intact for at least a couple of years. I believe I've preserved them well, but I guess we'll see. The final step is just to add something to hang them from, and optionally, some embellishments. I used a gold cord that's been sitting around waiting for a use for years, and I simply tied it into a loop and glued the knotted side to the ugly side of the fruit. To cover up both the knot and the burnt area of skin, I glued on a larger bow using a wired ribbon and a nifty technique that I recently picked up on Pinterest. Next, we're sticking with the premise of sliced oranges drying in a low oven, only this time we'll be making these enchanted dried slices that glow when a light is placed behind them, kind of like stained glass. All you need to do is carefully cut citrus fruits into thin slices and allow them to dry in the oven. I've successfully made these both using a piece of chicken wire as a sort of stand-in for a cookie rack that I didn't have, and I've tried it right on the surface of a baking sheet. I think the mesh method is a little safer, but either way, you'll want to really be sure to check on these frequently. They'll dry out much faster than the whole fruit did, and they don't look anywhere near as pretty if they get burnt. In fact, I actually left some of mine in a little bit longer than I think I should have, especially the lemon and lime that I experimented with. Unlike the oranges, they're apparently less likely to keep their original color, and they seem to get dark very easily. But I did discover that even the ones that turned quite dark do have a nice glow to them when strategically placed directly in front of a twinkle light on the tree. You could simply poke holes in these with a large needle and hang them up with strings or wire hooks, and that's exactly what I did for a lot of them. But I also wanted to make fancier ornaments out of some of them. Here, I'm just stringing them with the same gold cord and gluing the knot down before covering it up with a cinnamon stick embellishment. You can decorate yours any way you'd like, but I found it fun to create the illusion that the whole thing was being held together with a single woven cord of gold. And now for the final citrus fruit ornament. We are making classic orange pomanders. Even though my family didn't celebrate a winter holiday growing up, I remember making these with my mom just because, and they were so fun to make and smelled absolutely heavenly. Pomanders are simple and straightforward. You just stick whole cloves into a citrus fruit, and it can be quite a meditative practice. Some folks just leave these around in places like fruit bowls, but I wanted to hang mine on the tree, so I tied a ribbon around mine before adding the cloves. Easy peasy. But I do have some tips for you though. First of all, don't try to be fancy like me and add thumbtacks as embellishments. I noticed later on that a dark haze began to bleed around those spots on the skin of the orange, which can happen anyway just with the cloves, but I think the metal from the tacks made it a lot worse. That being said, I did find it rather helpful to utilize sewing pins, just sparingly, to help hold the ribbons in place. They didn't seem to tarnish the orange skin like the tacks did. I should also tell you that I actually used cuties rather than full-size oranges. And my theory is that these were probably a lot easier to poke with the cloves than any other citrus fruit, and they will hopefully dry out more quickly and with less chance of mold developing, since they're small and they have a thinner skin. I have seen pictures online though of all different kinds of citrus fruits, and even other kinds of fruits being used to make pomanders, so go nuts if you're feeling lucky. I had originally intended to get really witchy with it and make each one of these a super well thought out sigil, but since simplicity is such a big intention for me right now, I decided to keep things extremely simple, and I just let the spell unfold more playfully. I did discover though that Amy over at Magical Crafting does have a great video on exactly that same idea though, so if the sigil spell idea sounds like fun to you, definitely check out her video. Okay, let's move on to pine cones. These are really cute and fun to make if you're willing to get a little bit messy. All you need to start are pine cones that are prepared for crafting. I say that because if you just go out and pick them, they will be dirty, they will be horribly sticky, and they might be full of bugs. But if you like to do your own foraging, all you need to do is first give them a really good rinse, and then put them on a cookie sheet that you don't care too much about. Again, put it in the oven on that low heat for a little while, and that'll cook out the bugs, get rid of the dirt, and it'll even do this interesting thing with the sap where it crystallizes it so that it no longer is the most horribly sticky thing that you'll ever deal with. So I highly recommend doing that, or you can just get pine cones from a craft store. You'll also need some kind of glue or paint and something powdery and white. If you want it to be extra eco-friendly, you could use white glue and Epsom salts only. I happen to have a really old tube of non-biodegradable glitter, which I do avoid purchasing now, but since it's been in my craft drawer for literally decades, I decided to make use of it. I didn't have white glue on hand, but I did have a clear acrylic paint with glitter in it, so I used that as my base. All you need to do is first roll the pine cone around in the glue or paint, or you could paint it onto the tips of the pine cone with a brush, and then either roll it around in the powder or sprinkle it on. This shouldn't take too long to dry, and you can probably finish the ornaments within an hour. Once they're dry, it's time to add something to hang them as ornaments. Technically, you could actually skip this step if you wanted to, because pine cones actually sit really well in artificial pine trees on their own. They kind of stick in there like Velcro, but I wanted mine to be super ornate and to have this sort of hung swag vibe. So I repeated what I did earlier with the dried orange orbs, and I just glued on a cord and a bow. I tried this technique with 2 different types of cones, and I'm really glad that I did. The fat cones made a lovely ornament just on their own, but I had wanted to also include some sprigs of artificial evergreen, which didn't sit well with their shape, but they worked perfectly with the long skinny cones. And now that I'm thinking of it, if you don't want this fake snow look, you could obviously do this exact same craft, just skipping the first step. Next, let's get painterly and design some DIY mushrooms out of champagne corks. Now, this is one of those crafts that depends on what kinds of junk you've been stashing to upcycle, so if you don't happen to have 3 years worth of corks, perhaps you can start saving them now for next year. And if you don't drink bubbly, you can just use this as inspiration and make your mushrooms out of other materials you do have access to. There's all kinds of things that could be used, but this is the simplest and most straightforward way that I could think of, and it was so satisfying to finally know what I was going to do with all those corks that I had been hoarding for ages. The first step is to paint the mushroom caps. I used acrylic paint. I also experimented with leaving some of the stems natural and painting others with a semi-translucent metallic white paint. This is for the most part very easy, but there is patience involved so that the paint can dry in between being handled. Acrylic paint does dry pretty quickly though. Doesn't this scene just make you think of the Mario theme music? Like do 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 do. Anybody? Anybody? Maybe it's just me. Now let's make them look like they've been freshly picked from the forest floor by gluing on some moss with clear glue. I found it worked best when I used the crumbs of moss that were left at the bottom of the package rather than the large bundles of it, and it was a great way to use up that powdery stuff that doesn't get used for other crafts. Next, we're going to make them look more like Amanita muscaria mushrooms by adding detail with a white puff paint. If you don't know what Amanita muscaria mushrooms are, I invite you to look them up online in the context of the origins of Christmas and prepare to have your mind blown. It's a winter solstice-tide rabbit hole well worth going down if you have a curious mind. You're welcome. Again, this is fairly simple if you have a steady enough hand, but it can be tricky to position them so that the one side can be drying while the other is laying flat. I tried to do it in such a way that I'd get as much done as possible in one sitting so that the drying time could be minimized. Puff paint does need to dry completely, so leave this alone for several hours. Once everything is dried completely, it's time to find a way to hang them up. For the ones that are pure cork, you can easily screw a metal hook into the top. I only had a few of those hooks though, so I also used some floral wire to make my own hooks. And for the corks with plastic caps, I made these other hooks out of wire and glued them on. And now for our final ornament before our garland and the final tree reveal. Let's make icicle ornaments out of tin foil. This project was inspired by a Pinterest pin I saw for a Victorian-inspired ornament made from flattened craft wire. I had no idea that flattened craft wire even existed, and I definitely didn't have any on hand, so I tried making them out of upcycled heavy-duty tinfoil. I tried this a few different ways and got better with more practice, but even the sloppier ones look fine on the tree. I just put them not quite at eye level. I started by cutting the foil into strips and folding them until I had something resembling the flattened wire I saw online. Then I twisted it until it began to look like an icicle. I pinched one end to look like the bottom tip of an icicle, and then I punched a hole in the other end using a thumbtack to hang it up with a wire hook. If you prefer a more neat spiral, you'll just want to utilize some crafting tools more intentionally. I discovered that I could make my icicles more uniform by using a ruler to help me with the folding, and smoothing the foil out with this scraper tool that came with some adhesive vinyl that I used to make my grimoire journals for the Writing Wood shop. I also noticed that the thinner you can get your faux flattened wire, the easier it is to get it to have more of a uniform twisty pattern when you go to twist it. Alright, are you ready for the final craft? Let's make a natural garland out of popcorn and cranberries. This is a fairly straightforward craft, but there are some important tips to be aware of. First things first, make sure you're using plain popcorn that doesn't have butter or anything on it. You can find plain microwave popcorn in some grocery stores, but I made mine the old-fashioned way. This was actually a pleasantly surprising successful experiment, seeing as the last time I tried to make popcorn on the stove, it was to eat, and I made the mistake of putting butter or oil in the pan with the raw kernels, which caused them to burn. As it turns out, the best method is just to use a dry pot on medium heat at first, and then lower the heat once it starts popping. The popped corns will pop up to the top of the pot, while the heavy little seeds will stay at the bottom until they're hot enough to pop. You can shake the pot around a little to make sure they fall to the bottom and the white ones don't get too close to the bottom and burn. I used a lid carefully so that the hot air stayed in, but the steam was allowed to release. I totally just eyeballed the amount, and as it turned out, just covering the bottom with one layer of kernels yielded the perfect amount of popcorn for the pot to fill. The next thing to be aware of is that stringing popcorn isn't necessarily as easy as you might think. The shells are actually really tough, so I found it easiest to try stabbing only through the white parts of the popcorn, and I learned the hard way that you can injure yourself if you're not careful. So I ended up using a thimble to push the needle through, and then if it was still really hard to pull on the other side, I used needle nose pliers to pull it the rest of the way through. The cranberries are optional, and you could use other types of red winter berries if you have them on hand. Just be sure to weed out any that are going soft on you, because the juice can cause the popcorn to melt and fall off around it. This is a simple and relaxing project, but it can take a long time depending on how much garland you need. And I ended up needing kind of a lot. And during that process, I also discovered that slightly stale popcorn is stronger and more durable and less likely to break when you're handling it. Since the thread can get a bit tangled at times, I didn't try to make one ginormous garland. I instead wrapped the thread around my forearm 4 times so that once it was doubled over, it would be about twice the length of my arm, a manageable length for me. I later tied 2 or 3 of these segments together to make longer garlands, and then I sewed hemp rope loops to the ends of them to make it easier to hang on the tree. I have no idea what to expect with these longevity-wise, but I'm hoping the fruit will dry out nicely and the stale popcorn will last for at least a few years. But again, as with the oranges, we'll see what happens. Alright, magical mavens, are you ready to watch me put together the final winter solstice home prosperity spell? The winter solstice is always a great time to clear out the old and celebrate the new. So along with decorating my year-round Sabbath trees for winter, I also took this as an opportunity to get rid of the twinkle light wall that I've had up since I moved in 3 years ago, which I've been meaning to change for a while, but interestingly, it started burning out in dramatic little flashes, section by section over the course of this past month, almost as if it was planned. You'll also get to laugh at me as I attempt to put up a larger, more complicated tree for the first time in my life. I got this secondhand and it didn't come with an instruction manual, and I also didn't realize that it wasn't a pre-lit tree, so I had to get crafty to come up with lights for it. And to help bless my spell, Mother Nature gifted me with an absolutely insane blizzard while I was working on this, so the final reveal is going to look so magical. So refill your chalice with something cozy, and let's make some magic. Winter Solstice blessings, magical mavens. This video was an absolute doozy to make, and it was so worth it. If you enjoy the content I create on this channel, I would love it if you would consider supporting me on Patreon. I've been told that the benefits are way above and beyond what's expected for the cost of each tier, and you get to connect with me and other magical mavens about magical living and seasonal manifesting. If you don't want magical grimoire goodies every month, a witchy online community, and fun seasonal challenges, there is also a link at the very bottom of the description of all of my YouTube videos where you can just give a one-time donation of any amount you'd like through PayPal. Thank you so much for your support, and I'm so excited to create more crafty content for you in 2023. Solstice blessings and a Happy New Year. And for more winter witchery, I invite you to check out this playlist right here, where you'll find more videos of me decorating other parts of my house this year, as well as some more informational videos about how to work with the winter solstice to manifest your best life. See you there.